Hi everyone. We're back with another tutorial which was kindly requested in the comments of my line art tips video. And this is another struggle that a lot of beginner artists have when they're starting out, which means today we will be talking about shading. As a beginner, I used to mostly apply shadows randomly, not really taking into account things like light sources or 3D shapes. I also used to struggle with my art looking kind of muddy or pretty much not shaded at all. Here are some examples using my old art. With this one, even though it's meant to be a sunny day, the skin on the character looks flat and pretty gray. Or this one, where I was so shy with the shadows that it barely looks like there's any shading there at all. But of course, as everything else in the art world, these setbacks can be fixed with some knowledge and some practice. I'd like to mention that this is how I personally prefer to shade my art, and these tips are things that helped me specifically. If you find some other method to do shadows that works better for you, then of course feel free to use that instead. This is all just to give you some ideas to think about when you next start drawing. So anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. To start off simple, I'll be explaining two different types of shading. Here we have two circles that I've drawn preemptively. Currently, they look flat and there's no insinuation whatsoever about any sort of 3D shape. The two main ways of shading that I've seen as I've learned about art are cell shading and soft shading. Cell shading is more often used in cartoons and anime. As you can see in these examples, the shading is done with clear lines, and there may be a little bit of airbrushing involved, but it's mostly kept simple. The shading is also mostly placed only where it's necessary, rather than trying to emulate a more realistic, detailed type of shading seen in real life. So using this example on our circle, we start off with the flat color, which is the original color of our piece without taking into account any shading or lighting. In this case, it's this light gray. Then we'll pick a darker color for our shadow, and when we do this line, we are following the shape of the circle. That way, we're insinuating that this circle is more of a sphere. We're emulating a simplified way of what a 3D sphere would look like. Then we'll pick a lighter color, and again, following the shape of the circle, we will add the light. Depending on how simple or detailed you want your cell shading to be, you could add darker and lighter tones too. Now for soft shading. Here we would start off similar to cell shading, but instead we will soften up the shadows, making them blend more into each other. This type of shading style tends to be more realistic. With this style, more details tend to show, and it can be more complicated than cell shading. While most of it looks softer and blended, there is a mix here, and this is where form shadows and cast shadows come into play. Form shadows tend to be softer and are the ones that insinuate the shape of an object. So here on the arm you can see a soft gradient from light to dark to show the roundness of the arm. Cast shadows, on the other hand, are the shadows created by an object blocking the light over another object. So here you can see where the skirt ends, there is a harder line on the leg compared to the form shadows around that same leg. Cast shadows tend to be sharper. So on our circle, we'll start off as if we were doing cell shading, that way we can keep it simple. But then we will take the smudge tool and use it to blend the colors together. Alternatively, if you are sure that essentially your whole layer is going to be blended, then you can also just go to the magic wand tool and click the Gaussian blur option and play around with the intensity there. Same thing goes for the lighting, and we can also add cast shadows to both of the circles. Even though cast shadows do tend to be sharper for the soft shaded circle, I still like to soften the cast shadow lines a little bit. This keeps it all a little bit more cohesive. But of course, we need to be careful not to do it too much or the whole piece will look sort of blurry. Now that we have the base shadows done, the next step of shading comes in: the environment. Here, the material of your object starts to matter, since certain objects will react to shadows and light differently. A shiny object like metal may reflect shadows and light way more sharply. Meanwhile, a more opaque object may have more muted and soft shadows. Honestly, the best way to learn about these differences is to simply look up lots of references when you're drawing. Keep in mind the materials you're trying to show in your piece and try finding specific references for said materials as you're doing all this shading. For this tutorial, however, we'll use a more opaque material for our spheres. Light in the real world bounces around and reflects off pretty much every object. This reflected light often shows up where the shadow is. So, for example, with this sphere, since it's on the floor, the light bouncing off the floor would reflect at the bottom of the sphere. Since the sphere is opaque, the reflection will be minimal, and it will be mostly smudged and blended in. Though, with stronger lighting or shinier objects, like I said before, these reflections would be a lot sharper. For cell shading, this reflected light is not often included unless the light is very strong or the object is very shiny. But anyways, with these fundamentals covered, I will now move on to a more complex example using my own art. I'll also give some tips on how to choose colors for your shadows and how to make certain shadows stand out as I go through the process, so stay tuned! So here we have a drawing that I made preemptively from Hades 2, and we have all our layers, and we are going to start by creating a layer on top of our flat colors layer and set it to multiply. Multiply is a very helpful layer mode because it allows us to essentially pick one color and then get a rough base for what all our shadows will be like. The trick to not getting it to look too muddy is to pick a color that matches the environment that your character or illustration is in. So here for mine, I am going for a more like purplish reddish for the multiply, and then we will take into account where our light is coming from and start off with doing shading. For these initial shadows, I'm kind of drawing them sort of like as if I were going to do cell shading. So this helps simplify and kind of make it easier to visualize where every shadow is going to go. So I'm just painting them in normally without really worrying about any blending or anything else at the moment. Then once that's done, I lower the opacity to around 50% and sort of like airbrush a little bit of eraser around some of the edges of the shadows to lighten them even more, and throw a Gaussian blur over the top of everything and start smudging some edges to blend everything together. I then create a new layer with an overlay blending mode on top, and this is where we're going to add subsurface scattering. So subsurface scattering is essentially when light passes through an object that isn't entirely solid. That object will kind of like displace the light a little bit. So for example, in our skin, since our skin is very red and it has blood vessels in it, then we could see a bit of like a red diffusion along the light. I tend to use a brush that has a little bit of color jittering, as you can see, so every paint stroke will give me a slightly different color, which I think helps make it look more natural. But if you prefer a more stable color, then of course you can use that too. But I am now proceeding to very lightly with a low opacity brush paint over mostly the edges of the shadow on her face and kind of like giving it a lot more color and making her feel essentially more alive. This overlay layer doesn't just apply to the skin, I pretty much use it on all the other parts of the painting. So like for her hair, I'll change it to a color that is more what her hair would be like, and use the overlay to kind of change the color of the shadows there. I think this for me is essentially just the magic layer that helps my shadows look vibrant, and helps me like change the color and hue of certain shadows to make the whole piece look a little bit more different and less muddy and gray like they used to be. Here I'm turning the layer on and off so you can see the difference that it makes. You know, it helps everything look a lot more alive and a lot nicer. And then I'll proceed to do it pretty much in every element. I can also use overlay to add some even darker shadows and add some of the reflective light too. So essentially in this overlay layer is where I'm just going into all the details and all the rendering fully. You can, if you'd like, just split up the layers, so create multiple layers of overlay. That way, if you're scared that maybe you'll ruin an aspect of your piece with it, then that won't happen. And with that, our shading tutorial comes to an end. I hope you guys found it helpful. If you have any questions about the process or the brushes that I use, then feel free to shout them off in the comments. And, you know, if there's any other tutorials you'd like to see, I'd be happy to provide. And yeah,